In 1775, a handful of farmers, shopkeepers, and lawyers declared war on the most powerful empire on earth. Great Britain ruled the seas with the largest navy in the world, commanded a professional army that had crushed enemies across the globe, and controlled territory on nearly every continent. Against them stood 13 small colonies with no navy, no real army, almost no money, and barely a government to speak of. On paper, it was suicide. And yet, 8 years later, those colonies were a free and independent nation. So how did the tiny United States defeat the mighty British Empire? Let's break it down. First, let's be clear about just how lopsided this was. Great Britain had around 8 million people, a treasury fed by a global empire, the best trained soldiers in the world, and a navy of hundreds of warships that ruled every ocean. The colonies had maybe 2.5 million people, and as many as a third of them did not even want independence. They had no professional army, no navy at all, no national treasury, and 13 squabbling local governments that could barely agree on anything. It really should have been over within a year. But Britain had one enormous invisible enemy: distance. The colonies were 3,000 miles away, across a vast and stormy ocean. Every single soldier, every musket, every barrel of gunpowder, and every order from London had to make a dangerous 6 to 8 week voyage under sail. If a general in America needed reinforcements, he might wait half a year just to get them. Fighting a war across an entire ocean was painfully slow, brutally expensive, and a logistical nightmare that quietly drained the British treasury day after day after day. Meanwhile, the Americans were fighting in their own backyard. They knew every forest, every river, and every back road. They were defending their own homes and their own families, which gave them a stubbornness that paid soldiers simply did not have. And the land itself was enormous. Britain could march in and capture a city, but the moment their army moved on, the surrounding countryside slipped right back out of their control. There was no single capital they could seize to instantly end the war. America was simply too big to truly conquer. This led to the colonies' secret strategy, and it was genius in its simplicity. They realized they did not actually have to defeat the British Army. They just had to avoid being destroyed. Their commander, George Washington, understood that as long as he kept his army alive, the rebellion stayed alive too. So instead of risking everything in big open battles he was likely to lose, he retreated, he dodged, he struck, and then slipped away. He turned the whole war into a long, grinding test of patience. And patience was the one thing the British were slowly running out of. The Americans also refused to always fight by the rules. British soldiers were trained to march in tight, disciplined lines out in the open field. So the colonists often simply did not. They fired from behind trees, stone walls, and fences. They picked off enemy officers, ambushed supply columns, and then melted away into the woods. To the proud British regulars, it felt dishonorable, almost like cheating. But it worked, slowly bleeding the enemy army with every single mile it tried to march. Still, the war was very nearly lost more than once. Washington's true genius was not in winning battles, it was in refusing to give up. Through crushing defeats in a brutal winter at Valley Forge, where his ragged men froze and starved in the snow, he somehow held the army together. He kept them drilled, he fed them whatever he could, and he gave them something to believe in. As long as Washington and his army survived that winter, the fragile dream of independence survived right along with them. Then came the turning point of the entire war, the Battle of Saratoga. In 1757, an entire British army marching down from Canada was surrounded and forced to surrender to the Americans. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory. And its real importance was not the soldiers who were captured, it was who happened to be watching. Far across the ocean, the King of France had been waiting to see if these rebels actually stood a real chance. Saratoga was the proof that he had been waiting for. And this brings us to the single biggest reason that America won: France. Still bitter from losing to Britain in earlier wars, France saw the perfect chance for revenge. So after Saratoga, they openly joined the war on the American side. And they did not just send kind words of encouragement. They sent money, weapons, gunpowder, trained officers, thousands of soldiers, and most important of all, a large and powerful navy. Suddenly, the ragtag colonies had the full backing of a global superpower of their very own. This single decision changed absolutely everything. What had been a small colonial rebellion now exploded into a global war. Before long, Spain and the Dutch joined in against Britain as well. Now Britain was not just fighting farmers in America. It was defending its territories, its trade routes, and its precious islands all around the world, all at the very same time. Britain's mighty navy, once free to blockade the American coast at will, suddenly had to rush off to protect the entire empire. The colonies were no longer Britain's biggest problem. All of this came crashing together at a town called Yorktown in 1781. A large British army under General Cornwallis had backed itself up against the coast, fully expecting the Royal Navy to sail in and rescue it by sea, exactly as it always had before. But this time a French fleet arrived there first and sealed off the harbor. Trapped between a combined American and French army on land and the French Navy out at sea, with no escape and no rescue coming, Cornwallis had no choice left. He surrendered his entire army. It was the blow that finally broke Britain's will to keep fighting. Because back home in Britain, the public was utterly sick of it. The war had dragged on for years, swallowed an absolute mountain of money, piled up enormous debt, and now it was being fought against half of Europe at the same time. People began to ask one very simple question. Were a few distant rebellious colonies really worth all of this blood and treasure? More and more often, the answer in London was no. And so the British government finally decided that this war was simply no longer worth winning. And so in the year 1783, Britain signed the Treaty of Paris, formally recognizing the United States of America as a free and independent nation. The most powerful empire on the entire planet had been forced to let 13 of its own colonies go free. It was a humiliation that stunned the watching world, and an inspiration that would go on to echo through other revolutions for centuries to come. So, how did a tiny colony defeat a global empire? Not with one single miracle, but with many things all at once. The impossible distance across the ocean, the sheer vastness of the land, a clever strategy built on simply surviving, the stubborn brilliance of refusing to quit, and the decisive help of France. The Americans never really needed to outfight the entire British Empire. They just had to make the war so long, so costly, and so painful that the empire itself finally decided it was not worth it. And in the end, that is exactly what they did. Like this video, if you learned something new and stay curious,